and welcome to your training for the Quality First Toolkit around social, emotional, mental health needs. So before we get started, make sure that you're comfortable, you've got yourselves a drink and that you're prepared for the session. But note, these are going to remain available for you. So if you want to have access to them, you can do it at any time. They're not going to be deleted, and hopefully you can dip in and out for CPD reasons for your school setting as well. So what am I going to do as regards to this area of need for the toolkit? We will go through and develop our understanding around social, emotional, mental health. We'll have a look and explore some of the strategies that are presented in the toolkit. And we will try to unpick them a little bit further, but I am going to try and give some of that understanding behind the reason for us including the strategies as well. And again, we'll link it to the authority document of getting it right for SEND. So where does this all fit with the code of practice? Well, we know that actually updating and making sure our quality first teaching is of that higher quality, we will be able to ensure that children are catered for this broad area of need as well. And like we've said in other presentations, if it becomes quality first teaching, we are more likely to sustain that approach, and it's more effective in terms of the progress of our young people as well. When we're looking at social emotional health, in particular around the code of practice, we know that children can experience a wide range of emotional difficulties, and these can be manifested in several different ways. And it could be the quiet children will go very insular. Of course, we might recognise more readily the children that are quite explosive in their behaviours around that. So the code of practice is telling us to be wary. Don't just label children. Make sure that we are looking at these challenging behaviours, the disruptive behaviours, and highlighting actually, is this an underlying mental health need? Also from the code of practice, we should have clear support for our young people in regards to this disruptive behaviour. So we need to provide that evidence. We've got a whole school approach at supporting these young people. And the DFE have provided a document for us that could go some way to supporting and the guidance in and around managing these behaviours as well. It's quite often useful to go back to some of these codes of practice and papers that are given to us as we are refreshing our policies and standards, just to make sure we're not deviating too far away from what we have to and what is statutory to include. So what does Walsall state in terms of us getting it right? Well, we know we need to identify this primary area of need. So in the world of social, emotional, mental health, this isn't just labelling children as naughty or using the behaviour as the first instance. It's about drilling down to perhaps find some of the causes for that behaviour. We also need to find out what band they're suited in. So can we cover these needs at that universal level, or are we taking this child through our graduated response, and do they need more support? And again, it is about identifying that primary area of need. So we're bearing that in mind all of the time. There's two paragraphs in particular that Walsall have used in terms of social, emotional, mental health, and I wanted to share them with you directly today. Part of it could be that we are aware of the known triggers for, if you like, this social, emotional bubble or hiccup for a child. So that could be a bereavement. Certainly in this climate that we're in, returning from the pandemic, that again is a clear known trigger that we want to address and support a child moving forward. So it's some behaviours might be normal in response to that trigger. So we would well expect changes in behaviours in and around or following these triggers. Is it that we just need to support in the first instance and then they can be overcome? Or, when we move on to the second paragraph, is this becoming more persistent and more disruptive over time? because if that is the case, this is where we're building this evidence of support to say this child is moving further forward down that SEN register and our graduated response. And if this is the case, we really have to remember our multi-agency responses here. So it's important to think and look about your early help, and is that a way and a route that's possibly going to support this child moving forward. So WARSAL have given us again in the banding document some ideas and support moving forward. So at a universal level, are we and have we got an inclusive behaviour policy? Are we thinking about these children at that quality first level? Some strategies that you might have in place around your emotional coaching, any transition toolkits that you've got in place, your circle time and your PHSCE. So again, for me, these are tools around quality first that I would be reflecting upon all of the time to ensure that that quality first teaching around social, emotional, mental health is there as standard across the curriculum, and we are supporting this, the breadth and depth of development in that area as well. And then if the child is having that equality first level but still requires a little bit more, and again this is thinking it could be a temporarily block of support, so thinking of those children that might have suffered a bereavement for instance, or this could be a block of support that is ongoing. But let's just remember as well that from the toolkit here you'll be given some examples and ideas of how we can tweak that quality first teaching and ensure that the child's getting the support at the right time. Moving through the document to our band 2s, just as we've mentioned with other broad areas of need from the Code of Practice, are we starting now to identify and put in place some of these strategies? So we're aware of how frequent the child's needing them, the duration of that intervention, whether they're able to move any sort of way forward independently, or are they requiring that adult support. So how are we now evidencing? And I can honestly say as a practitioner that goes into lots of different schools and settings, sometimes I find that the emotional help that we give in terms of building relationships with young people isn't evidenced because it's what we always do. So there might be little Bobby in your school, or a big Bobby if you're at secondary school, that's absolutely crucial that you do that meet and greet at the door. And it's those children that you worry about if you're off on a training course that day. Oh cranky, who's going to say hello to Bobby and make sure they've had a good night, etc. You do that because you're a good practitioner, and sometimes we don't write that down anywhere that that's something that Bobby needs to have a good day. So we have to be really clear and explicit when we're gathering our evidence that the child, that we do it in terms of forming relationships at a whole school level, but be aware of the children that if that strategy or that relationship is removed, it can be very detrimental very quickly. And it moves on to band 3, and remember we're looking at the intensity now, and again, just as with other broad areas of need, I'd be expecting external support and advice to be given around this child's needs at this point. Now, where has this all come about, or why do we talk about it? Because the stats tell us that social, emotional, mental health is increasing. It's an area of need that we are becoming more and more aware about, and it is impacting upon our children in fairly devastating ways. So this is the latest information that came through on January 19. And hopefully you can pick it out on the PowerPoint. If not, you can switch back to have a look at the PowerPoint without me yabbiting on. But we can see here we've got specific learning difficulties, moderate, severe. Our social, emotional, mental health here is behind speech and language communication. Now, our moderate learning difficulties, we always take with that pinch of salt in terms of the identifying of that with our statistics, but I think it's very clear to say it's sitting at 18.1%, and we're only comparing that to a 23-22%. this is one of the biggest areas of need that we're being faced with in the academic world. And there are other stats. So this is from the Children's Society here, but 1 in 4 people in the UK will experience a mental health difficulty within their lifetime. And I think it's safe to say that separate standards and statistics will come out on the back of the pandemic that we're already experiencing at the moment. So 16 million people are experiencing some sort of mental health problem as we speak. Any one time, a sixth of the population, that means 1 in 10 school children. So now we're looking at every classroom of 30, we've got 3 children that will be experiencing a significant mental health difficulty. And that's not just the children that are having the little wobbles on that day. So if there are practitioners in your setting, and I don't think there are, but if you have some that think, well, this isn't for me, this isn't for my class, we don't have those needs, we need to bear in mind that the stats are telling us these pupils exist in our classrooms. And 75% of our mental illness is established by the time we're 18. So we can unpick and support moving forward that will adjust the severity of that for our young people. It costs an awful lot for us as a nation, so let's see if we can make that cost-effective change in schools for us. And it is now the single largest disability across the nation. So that sounds very, very bleak, but there are an awful lot of strategies and support systems in place to move us forward. So what do we want to see? Well, we want to see children that are mentally healthy in schools. And if that's the case, we've got psychologically, emotionally, intellectually, spiritually, there we are, that's the better one, spiritually rounded children. These children that can adapt to change, adapt to different relationships, adapt to different environments well. We want to be able to see if they can sustain relationships, so not just make them, but keep them going in a positive way. Play and learn effectively, work well with others, have a strong sense of what's right and wrong. This is what we're aiming for, and this is what we should be wanting to achieve. And for myself as an SEN advocate, I think this comes before the academic stages. If children in my class can leave well-rounded and like this, I will take the hit on an academic level. So how do I ensure I've got an outstanding school support system? Well, the DFE has given us a definition. We want to be promoting resilience in our pupils, especially if this is more challenging in their home environment. We want to be safe and secure, and this is what we are trying to develop for our children in the ethos of the setting that we work with. We want to make sure they feel as though they belong within our school setting as well. So for me, you have to take this question back to your staff, and we have to consider what makes your school and your setting socially, emotionally, mentally healthy setting. So do we need to do more? So when you've perhaps looked at the toolkit and we are stating things that should be there at a quality first level, do you feel you need to shift some of those strategies to ensure that they're embedded? Is your response clear and structured? So are all of your staff aware of the meet and greet and the scripts that we could follow, for instance? How are we going to prevent these children having blips? So predicting and that anticipatory duty comes in again, that are we foreseeing perhaps when puberty strikes that mental health is going to potentially be an issue? Are we noticing patterns of bullying across school, and can we step in, and where are we stepping in? So these should be included in all of your policies. And of course we've got a huge blip at the moment in and around the pandemic. Are we working to support and ensure that we've got these strategies and staff feel safe and secure in those strategies, so they can then move forward and work with the young people as soon as they're back? And of course this comes all down to strong safeguarding measures. So we would want to ensure that all staff are up to date in those policies, which I know we do really well as an authority. So I will have some non-negotiables for the classroom. We want to ensure that we are aware of the vulnerabilities of the cohorts coming into our classroom. I have the pleasure, and we have the pleasure at NIAT, to go right across the borough, and I can guarantee and I can tell you now that no one setting is exactly the same. We all have our demographic. The children coming to us are experiencing their unique little subcultures within the borough of Walsall, and for me we have to be aware of that demographic for our setting in particular. How are we at creating that nurturing environment? Have we got that supportive relationships? Are we coming from a point of mutual respect, or are we expecting respect, which is a very different approach to be taking? How well have we planned the curriculum and ensure that we've got our enthusiastic learners that not only want to learn but can demonstrate that positive mental health, that resilience and motivation that we know is important? Opportunities, are they meaningful inside and outside the classroom? And a big one we need to make sure we've got that positive slant to is our rules and our boundaries and the reward systems, because on the back of that is our consequences within a school setting as well. Sometimes we can become too focused upon the consequences to a system, and we need to make sure, and as SENCO we should be working exceptionally hard to ensure that we're working on the reward side of things. And I would urge you that if there is the problem child, and I hate to use inverted commas but I'm going to, but if I have the child whose behaviour is becoming too challenging, I would take a step back and see if we have got the balance correct in terms of the rewards and the sanctions, and are we following that behaviour, the behaviour policy, appropriately for the individual. So how might we suggest you put together this visual of the vulnerabilities? Gone are the days, and I remember making them and they were painstaking. We would create Excel spreadsheets that would try to highlight the level of vulnerability in the class, and dare I say, at the time when I was first doing them, it was more Ofsted driven, so that they could walk into the classroom and see the complexity of the dynamic of that room. However, I don't know anybody that actually spent time looking at that Excel spreadsheet. It just took us an awfully long time to create. So we want to move away from that, but I also want to be able to show the drill down approach and the needs of that classroom. This becomes really crucial, because if I have got a classroom that is emotionally broken, and as a class teacher I need to put more strategies in to support their relationships, because remember Maslow states that until this has taken place I won't be able to move on with the cognition and their learning. I need to give more time to that. So it could be I weight my curriculum and their experiences to more PHSCE style approaches before I can move them on. That will equate to less work in their books from my class, but by crikey, when they come to do work in their books, it's going to be of a much better standard. They'll be reaching their potential. If I can provide the evidence of where that's come from as a decision from my point of view, I'm fulfilling my teacher standards, and I'm ensuring the children, all children, not just SEN children, are getting what they need. And this is how I might do it. So we would have each child represented by one circle. So we've got 30 there, if you've got a bigger class, add more circles. But we would then add a colour-coded system to match the vulnerabilities of your demographic. So for instance, if they're a looked after child, they might be blue. If they're EAL, if they're from a travelling background, if they've got a specific learning difficulty, so on and so forth, you would list the vulnerabilities. Then I would quite clearly just colour in each bubble. I could initially, if necessary, don't need to. This is just the visual representative. And what I tended to do was to stick that in register order, so I could identify which child that was, but no names were linked to it directly. But we can see the children that have got multiple vulnerabilities versus those with no vulnerabilities, or one or two. It's a huge visual that will scream to anybody visiting that classroom, but to, as yourself as a practitioner, why progress might take a slightly different route for this class. And what difficulties might, oh goodness me, I can't get my words out. What difficulties might we be seeing in the classroom if my vulnerable bubbles are very rainbow-like and multicoloured? So I've got really complex children. Well, I'm going to see low self-esteem, probably difficulties with resilience, lots of huffing and puffing, the children that are reluctant to get started on their work, anxiety behaviours, any attachment difficulties. So I'm working hard to build relationships, but they're fighting me at each step. Self-assessment skills are going to be poor, and that will link back to the low self-esteem. And then the biggie that we're facing more and more is this lack of self-regulation around their emotions, and being able to self-monitor that and adjust their emotions back in a safe and calm way for themselves and other children in the setting as well. What can make it worse? Well, actually, if I overload them from a sensory point of view, and I know that if you reflect back on the physical and sensory presentation that we've given for you, it will give you ideas about how you might be able to unpick that. A lack of unconditional positive regard. We all know the children that become that child or that family. These young people that actually have tarnished, and we might start off with a negative response to them. We have to make sure that that's not the case at all. Unpredictable schedule, so changes in the timetable. If I have, as the professionals, have identified these needs later, again going back with the stigma perhaps is attached to them. It might be that they're in a cohort that lacks positive role models, or they don't feel part of the school community or the wider community for various reasons. So this is the worst cocktail possible in terms of exacerbating and increasing a child's mental health needs. What that could be then is a cycle that continues to escalate around negative behaviours. So if these things are going on for me, I'm going to feel down and quite weepy. This will make me then lethargic and tired. I might want to spend more time alone and isolated, stay in bed. The thoughts that I will then have, that I've wasted my day and never change, no one likes me, I've failed at today, feeds back into those internal feelings. And once we're on that pathway, sometimes, and a lot of times, it takes somebody external to us to guide us onto the right path. And I think in this current climate, we have perhaps entered this cycle more often as individuals than we would have done in a normal, balanced lifestyle. So hopefully we're coming from a point of more empathy at this moment in time. And if I'm in that cycle, then I've got a natural human response that I will fall to. As humans, we're either going to fight, well, we want the survival instinct to kick in, so we want to survive, and sometimes I'm going to do that by fighting if I think I can be bigger than the perceived attacker or situation that's attacking me. I will fight it, or I might run away and hide. And this visual, again, you can see where I've got this from on the web. But what I do like about it is it links the emotions that are connected to it. So if I've got someone who's a fighter, Generally, my overriding emotion is that anger. Now, we will come back to that, because actually what we need to do is unpack the anger, because anger is a secondary emotion. So we don't just stop at, gosh, that child's so angry. We have to say, what is causing that anger? But the outcomes then, because you don't want to feel this angry and you don't want to be such a fighter, we tend to externalise the causes of that behaviour. So I might throw out my insults, I might blame other people around me. If I'm a fighter, that's what you might see. If I take flight, again I might take denial, I keep trying to run away from the situation. This can be the children where the relationships are building up lovely, but just perhaps as they're getting vulnerable and ready to open up, will take flight. So they might be avoidant, or as I say, this sabotage approach to relationships. Some might face it, they feel connected, they feel safe, and of course that's where we're wanting to move children to. Or we have the freeze, we have the shutdown approach. So we have to remember, and for me working with young people, it is useful to see what particular situation cause a different human response. If I am a fighter, there tends to always be some activity where I perhaps enjoy or feel more motivated, where I will stand and face. And I have to be able to use those situations or those times in the curriculum where I can see those behaviours to help me address some of the other needs. So it's a useful tool and thing to think about in order to help us identify any primary needs. So unpicking that behaviour, what would I potentially start to fill in as a practitioner? It's a table as simple as this, and if you have any other tools at your disposal, there's two things we can do. If you've got a brilliant one in your setting, share it with us if you're willing, and we'll put it in the strategy toolkit area to make sure everybody can use that really well. But here's a rough guide for you. Where and when does the behaviour take place? Can we unpick it? And again, going back to a sensory cause in some of our other training for you, can we avoid that completely if it is a sensory trigger? Perhaps who was there, or who does the child think could help them? The behaviour that we're seeing, and then what was the consequence of that behaviour? Whether the consequence is a reaction from an adult in the environment or a physical consequence for the child. And let's try and drill down what the possible function of that behaviour was. So sometimes we might say that a child is doing attention-seeking behaviours, and as a service, and following on from some of the brilliant training that we have from a practitioner called Joanna Grace, she often talks about, let's not call it attention-seeking behaviour. We want to call this behaviour reassurance seeking. And when we just take that one step into that positive, actually it changes the function of why we perceive a child to do that behaviour. For me as a practitioner, and if I'm SENCO in a setting, it's this area of the table that I'm going to spend time with my staff unpicking, because if I move away from the consequence and I move to why, it's here I can put some of those strategies in place to support. And what really then are the changes that we need to put in place around a child? And this for me is, if you like, that initial assessment that we would be doing in and around a social, emotional, mental health child, where I can unpick some of the behaviours and think, well, I'm going to put some strategies in place. And one of the ways we can do that is from this visual that we've created for you. And I'm sure at some point on our website we'll make sure it's available for you. But what is the unmet need that's under the surface? So we know that, and we are all perhaps familiar with the iceberg model. Here we've got a behaviour that we're seeing, but what are the feelings and the needs that lie underneath? So what do we see? Who, where and how frequent? Any vulnerabilities we've known of that child? and then potential issues, and we've given you some pointers there. So is it the environment? Is it a health or a medical? Are they feeling a lack of connection? The task skills required, so is it an academic reason perhaps? Their values, thoughts and beliefs. Any task skills, again moving forward through that, and any relationships. So if I try to highlight some potential issues, you could then use the strategy toolkit to think, right, I'm going to put 1 or 2 strategies in place linked to some of these potential issues that could move the child forward. What we do know about social, emotional, mental health is that it can be really hard to drill down to those underlying causes. So a sense of trial and error is important, but as a practitioner, I need to be aware and keep the evidence of what we have put in place. What we don't want to do is to revisit the same strategies if we know they're not going to work. And then once we've identified those strategies, who's in charge of them, when are we going to do them, what would that look like? We could have a hypothesis of what we think is the cause. Ideally, the child will be working through this document with us and they might be able to voice part of that for us. And then what do we see? We want to review that. So this is perhaps a tool that we could use in place of your usual individual learning target document to set targets that are going to support your social, emotional, mental health with children. And addressing that issue, depersonalisation and distancing is important. Don't make it about them. Make sure that you are distancing the issues from them as a person. Give clear boundaries. And I know for an example, when we're talking about a child who's experienced a bereavement or loss, quite often we will excuse the behaviours because there's a clear reason for that, and we are sharing in that grief and the trauma of the young child. Unfortunately, then children tend to want those boundaries in place. So we can end up with a cycle where a child will, if you like, fight harder and stretch that behaviour further. It will become more and more extreme until they're finding the new boundary. And that's why we can sometimes end up with a cycle of real aggressive behaviour following a bereavement or loss. So that's one of the clear examples that we have to have clear boundaries. I might adjust the boundary with them, but I'm going to explain why I've adjusted the boundary, but this is still a step too far. So it's important that they're clear. What to do if, so if this is the behaviour that we see, or if you're feeling like this, let's be clear on what's acceptable you can do. Let's be factual where possible, and make sure that we are signposting the child and staff to people or areas where they can find support. Always offer, and I think this can become more challenging dependent on how many pupils you have in your setting, because actually there's less space. It can become more challenging potentially over a secondary setting, I can appreciate that. But finding a safe space that the child knows that they can withdraw to is crucial. And also making sure that the adults within the setting know that if they see a particular child, and I'm going to stick with Bobby, but if we see Bobby running down the corridor, we're not going to chastise him because there's a potential that he's going to his safe space. Visual support, so making sure that they're aware of the routine that's moving forward. Pre-warned while structured activities and transitions. Choice where possible, because if a child can make a choice around an activity or how, for instance, they're going to present that information to us, there's more ownership, and if there's more ownership, it becomes part of that positive regard for an activity. Feedback's got to be regular. Stress management techniques are really important, and not to do them in a jokey, laughy way, or find the balance between the humour that that can bring to a classroom, or seeing the importance that these strategies can have. So if we are breathing and we're doing relaxation techniques, are we giving them the kudos that they deserve, so that if a child does need them, they are willing to do them? Or are we placing too much humour to these sessions that actually it's detrimental to the children that need to put them in place? So think about your classroom design, or potentially an area within your setting that you could design to support it. But perhaps we've got our regulation. So here is the child who's perhaps in that stress response. And remember, we talked about human responses, that fight, flight, freeze, flop moment. We need them to be able to soothe and come out of that in their own time. Then we've got to the relate area of your classroom, or nurture space, hopefully. But this is where we can connect with the child. And if the child is used to this routine, they will naturally gravitate to the areas when they're ready to engage with that adult. It's almost their way of symbolising and showing us they're ready to talk. And then we've got the reasoning. So once they are calm and they're re-engaged, we can start learning again. So that's part of the process and the thinking you might be going down in terms of creating some of your safe spaces. And I've mentioned our unconditional positive regard. This is the key to identifying and working through trust with the young people that you're working with. They have to feel safe. So as it states on the slide there, the first message we give children is that the classroom is a safe place. The first time that I speak to a child that morning is not going to be to correct how they walk down the corridor, to correct how poorly they're wearing their uniform. I want them to know that they are safe, that they won't get hurt and others won't hurt you. And this is the reason I will take you back to the previous slide, that trying to create a safer space or a different zone within your setting is crucial. And having a plan on occasion, or where necessary, for the children perhaps who aren't in meltdown or witnessing a meltdown to find themselves in a safer space. So what's your backup if a child is perhaps really struggling to come away from their meltdown? How do we keep the other children safe? It's always worth having that plan as a group of staff. And how do we support in developing this sense of community? Well, first of all, for a child to flourish, they have to feel a valued part of that school community. And I think as soon as that connection's lost, it's a cycle for children to become school refusers, our children that unfortunately end up out of mainstream education and possibly in pupil referral units as well. So what are we going to do to promote that they have responsibilities within our setting, that they are welcomed within our setting and our community? And are we developing and working towards developing sort of these community links within our school and our immediate community as well? And some of the ethos and the ideas that we can move forward with to help us get there would be congruence. We've got Mary Poppins there as well. She's very dependable for a nice conversation as well. But this is where the adult is genuine and real. And this can come in a whole manner of guises. And the best thing that I could ever ask you to do as staff is to watch each other for really good practice, and also develop the ethos where I want to be told if I haven't handled something correctly. If I ask a child about how have you got on yesterday at football training, but then I turn away to deal with a conversation over here, that is very poor congruence. They can tell that I'm not really bothered, I'm asking for asking's sake. And you will note that the staff that do really well with the most vulnerable students have this in abundance. So again, observing each other's natural skills at dealing with this. can be a way of natural CPD within your setting. Attunement, being attuned with somebody's emotions as well and their needs. Yes, it is putting yourself in their shoes, but it's remembering that perhaps my upbringing and my cultural beliefs and experiences can be very, very different. So attunement is more than just stepping in somebody else's shoes. It's about stepping into their experiences, their culture, their understanding of the world, so I can then reflect on their choices and the behaviours and the words that they're saying back to me. And again, these non-negotiables that I might have in the classroom following this. But real experiences, when I'm talking about success and failures, I give it to them in the most realistic way possible, and I share my stories with them. Celebrating failure is important. We can often talk about building resilience, the fact that if I've made mistakes, it's the only way I'm going to learn. And this is more than just me and the teacher. This has to be this whole school ethos there. Goldilocks differentiation, so for want of perhaps a more grown-up approach to that, but essentially, am I doing the right differentiation for that child? Is it just right for them? Is the work appropriate? If I have got a social, emotional, mental health need, I'm going to find it really hard to be challenged academically until my Maslow needs are sorted. It has to be just right for them. And as the teacher, own it on the days where you think I've pushed them too far academically that has caused a behavioural output. I would take the blame for that, if you like, as a practitioner, and talk them through how I can help move things forward, just as how the child can help move things forward by altering perhaps their response to the situation. We've got to hold them in mind all the time, making sure that our structures and our routines are dependable. We all know within education that things can change at the drop of a hat, but have we got a way of symbolising change to the young people? This is something different today, but don't worry about it because I'm going to walk it through with you. Manageable contributions, so let's promote this self-esteem. Perhaps, you know, we've got in primary settings the school council approach to things where there's ownership. Maybe at secondary school we're looking at more enterprise approaches. How well are we utilising form time, for example, to promote our resilience and our self-esteem? I've not got this yet, which is a brilliant ethos to have. I can't do it yet, you know, so we want to make sure that the children believe that they're moving forward in their own pathway. The debrief is absolutely huge, and I'm going to pinpoint some activities with you really that can help you with the debrief. But for me it's absolutely crucial, and I will probably mention it 3 or 4 times and I won't apologise for it. But let's debrief, yes, those negative situations and see how we can have done differently. But also, if a child works for debrief, or that strategy works for them, are we debriefing a time when things have gone right? So part of that child who comes in every day and slams the door and does the shouty thing at the door, on the one day that they don't be sarcastic and reflect upon that behaviour like, crikey, O'Reilly, I didn't even know you were here because you didn't come and slam the door. Let's take that child away to a side later, really praise them for their choice and ask them, well, how was it that today was so much better for you? What went well? And debrief that scenario so that we can empower them to use those strategies again moving forward. So just like with the cognition and learning training that you had to listen to me about, I've gone through the toolkit and we have got different zones within the toolkit. We'll pull together a little bit of training, but most importantly now I'm going to try and run through those strategies that we've mentioned in the toolkit. So how can I support a child on that debrief and their monitoring of a situation? Well, one of the ones we tend to advise a lot would be backward chaining. And if you Google it, there are different ways that you can broach and go about delivering backward training as a debrief. So it's well worth having a look at. Over my own teaching experience, this is what it has become for me, so I'm going to share that with you. It could be here that I've got that negative outcome, and that could be a violent action or shouting out. Or of course, to flip with what I was saying earlier, that could be a really positive outcome that I want to drill back. Now, through my own experience of working with children who are struggling around their social, emotional, mental health needs, they do find it hard to start at this point. So for the sakes of this example, I'm going to say that there was a negative behaviour, so this child punched a peer. If I start here, the dialogue tends to be, well, he didn't do it, they told me and they said this, and it's all too much and too loud, and they're very defensive of that behaviour. I've found in my own experience, if I take them back to a positive that took place at the start, so that might be, but you were so fantastic in literacy, your teacher in DT on your last session told me you did really well in the work. So I take them out of this negative spiral and bring them back to a state of positive and calm. And then we work through. Now here is an example, there's 3 steps. Your backward chaining might have more or less steps. But let's take them through some key points and interaction that led to the negative outcome. And then as I'm talking through that with the child, it could be then that we come up with an alternative approach. So they've had a great literacy lesson, it was break time and they were queuing up, and poor Bobby had Jimmy push in front of him in the queue, and that was when the shouting started. So right here where that push and shove started to happen, let's think, what could we do differently? And here's where I would be hoping that child could say, well, I could say, oh, you've just pushed in front of me, would you mind going to the back of the queue? Of course, that would be very poetic if that happened, wouldn't it? But we are trying to give the children an alternative approach that we could consider there. Likewise, if we know this young person that would be too much, we could say, well, a good strategy for you would be to walk away, go and get an adult and explain that Jimmy pushed in. And then the adult can support them until that becomes more independent for the child to do. Another strategy I love to do are comic strip conversations. This works really well, and my example here would be if you've got that class clown, somebody who uses that behaviour. Remember, we don't say attention seeking, this reassurance seeking behaviour in the classroom. We could draw, and my drawing is much worse than that's on the board, but stick men to visualise the classroom. What do they say when you shout out, oh, you stupid miss? What do the other children think? And we put those thought bubbles in place. And I would also, as a teacher, say, what do you think I was thinking then? And this is where we can try to explain to the child that instead of thinking, well, I'm really cross, he's going to get a detention, I can actually say, oh, I'm really upset because I planned this activity for Bobby because I really thought he was going to like it. And just by opening up a different perspective or a different attitude can be really supportive. So that's how you can use this comic strip conversation as a debrief. The other thing we can do again, if it's a scenario that keeps cropping up for the young person, similar to a social story, we could give them a script that they could follow if that incident was to take place again. So it could be for some young people that we do the backward chaining, and then I link, sort of this middle situation where I could have had an alternative approach to a comic strip conversation for them to use hopefully again when they revisit a situation. And of course, if I've got the child that's really struggling to regulate their emotions, I would bring them back to the 1 to 5. So again, this is a scheme that you can buy. The resources would come with it, and you've also got some prompts or activity ideas. There is that much out there now that links to different characters. So I know during lockdown I've created a chart for my boys that's linked to superheroes, Hulk being 5, I think Flash is 3, and your Superman if you're a 1, and relative heroes in between. So you can make it personable to the children that you're working with. Stick to emojis for those older children. But what's important here is we're teaching the children that there's a sliding scale of emotion. I'm going to spend some time making sure they've got the language around emotions so that they can talk back to me. And I know a real push as a SENCO, certainly following the pandemic, I would want this to be a whole school approach so that we are all aware of the language of emotions that we are using. And of course that lends itself to being age appropriate straight away. One of the activities that I always enjoy doing with this pack and the young people that I'm working with is having a look at different scenarios or activities that we can play. So actually a spelling test, and I can tell you now if I was asked to do even a year 6 spelling test I'd die on the spot. Wouldn't necessarily make me feel a 3, I'd be up there at a 4 and beyond, to be honest. But actually for my best, well, at the time of primary school I'll always remember, the young girl I sat next to, she was brilliant at spelling, which is what got me through. For her it's probably a 1 because she was fantastic at it. So this is a super activity to do as a whole class, so we can see that different activities and different scenarios have a different response for individual children. And we can create that and link that to the anxiety curve. So how does that feel for you? Because one of the things as the teacher in ensuring we've got that congruence and we're attuned with the young people we're working with, I have to know that scale for them and know when it's one activity or one situation too far for them. Anything there, Nikki? Yeah. So this would then link to a zone of regulation. So once I've understood and they are more aware of their emotions, I need to now teach them that I don't have to get to a 5 before I bring myself back down to a 1. This isn't a scale where being at a 5 is a good thing. We are trying to teach the children that you can fluctuate and move between the numbers. So if I'm a 3, if I'm in that sort of yellow zone, what could I do that's going to bring me back down? And for me, a 3 is a really important number to focus upon, because I can be at a 3 because I'm a bit nervous. Likewise, I think I can be a number 3 in a positive way because I'm getting quite excited. But we all know those children that are quite excited, and before we know it, it tips into wrestling and a full-on fight. I am speaking about my whole life at this point with my 2 young boys. So I have to pick them up and say, oh, you're a 3, that's really good. Let's have some calm down time now. Let's bring us back down to a 2 and a 1, because oh, it would be sad if it went up to a 4. We have to support our young people in achieving that. So how do we support that emotional development in our young people and making them aware that everyone has feelings, everyone feels these different emotions, and they are completely normal and a natural thing to experience? We can do that via the scheme of 5 can make me lose control. One thing that I do know is that you can Google readily now some of these strategies and ideas, and I know during lockdown I've used this scale in my own house. I've got 2 small boys, and we put superheroes linked to some of those emotions as well, so you might find something similar yourself. In essence, what we're trying to do is to explain to the young people that these are the range of emotions we would feel. We can link the vocabulary to those emotions as well, and obviously dependent on the ages, the images would change to make sure that they're supporting the age group I'm working with, as would the language around the emotions that I'm using also. One of my favourite activities from this particular scheme that I always do, and it's brilliant to do with the whole class, is have a look at different scenarios that we could then link to how that makes us feel. this is really supportive of that congruence and the attunement with the children that you're working with, to know what is it that makes them feel that nervous feeling as well. So for me, if you offered me a Year 6 spelling test, I would be right at number 3, probably creeping up to a 4, because I would absolutely be terrified. Yet the young girl I sat next to in primary school, she was fantastic, so spellings would probably there at a 1, and you can perhaps see how I managed to get through primary school now, sat next to somebody that was brilliant at the things I couldn't do. So for this scenario, let's open up that conversation, whole class, to see what is it that makes us bubble and get worried. One of the things I always highlight around number 3 is that I can be feeling wobbly because I'm getting a bit nervous and my anxiety is kicking off, or I can be a bit wobbly because actually I'm feeling fairly excitable. And again, to use examples from my own children, during lockdown I have noticed that we're getting really excited over an activity. Before I know it, and if I don't support them in their regulation, that turns into a bit of pushing and shoving and a full-on fight. So it's about support and say, oh, we've had a really brilliant time, now let's bring that down and have some cool down time, so that now we can carry on in our happy zones of 1 and 2. Another thing that I will mention there as well, for me there's a difference. If I am excited at a number 3 and want a child to come back down, I refer that as my cool down. If I'm at number 3 because I'm quite agitated and I'm worried that that's going to go up the scale, I might ask them to calm down. And that's the difference in the script. Now, unfortunately, we have to go through this script, and working through the 1 to 5 scale will ensure that you get this right, because I can let you into another secret about me. If I'm at a 5, and it's usually when I'm sort of on a phone call conversation moaning to a company that I'm not happy, and then you're asked to calm down, that can be a trigger to ignite a more angry outburst. So working through this script with the children and young people is absolutely crucial, and then making sure all adults know that script. So you have spent some time developing an understanding with the children and their awareness of emotions. That's absolutely crucial to know that they are natural, we all feel them. From this point on now, I'm going to try and help teach the young people that I'm working with that it isn't just a scale that I have to work up to 5 before I can get to a 1. We want to be able to regulate ourselves through these emotions. So it's this zone of regulation here. What can I do when I'm feeling those different feelings? And again, dip into the physical and sensory training that we've done for you, because it could be that these are sensory diet strategies that would be helpful and you can put in place. But what is it? Do they need space? Do they need an adult? So on and so forth. So to regulate them, give them those proactive strategies. The other thing that can really help them with their thinking is this a big problem or a little problem? Is it a glitch? Is it tiny? Or is it becoming gigantic or emergency? And actually putting some understanding around that scale for them can be crucial. So emergency, for instance, is an earthquake, fire, danger, versus your Wi-Fi dipping out on your iPhone, for instance. So what's a real emergency, and trying to educate in and around that as well. But here we want to give them lots of I can do this to help me come from a 3 to a 2, I can do this. If I'm a 5, I can go and punch the pillow as opposed to getting myself into trouble. So lots of the strategies that the children can do. And again, just taking the conversation to a tool that the child can use, or a tool that we can share across the setting and with home. When I'm feeling this number, the words I use, what that looks like, what it feels like in my tummy maybe, and to feel safer or to feel a bit better, Now for me, the language in there is probably designed for more primary, but let's not talk about sort of older and younger children. Perhaps let's think about where they are developmentally. That might be perfectly suitable for an older child developmentally. But we can see how you could easily adapt the language in that to have the same principle from the strategy. The other thing I tend to use, and again with children developmentally who can handle this analogy, would be the assault cycle. So when we're saying here, here's the baseline behaviour, aka a 1, and a trigger takes place that starts accelerating my behaviour to a crisis point. I have to know what the child does, and ideally together, or certainly as the practitioner if I'm using this tool to isolate behaviours, I want to try and find out what the triggers are, because if I can identify the trigger, I can remove that trigger or support it. Now if I've got a child who's the exploder, where that happens very quickly, it's usually easier to identify the trigger because something happens and there follows the big behaviour. It's if we have a child who is the slow burner, that they have perhaps drip feeds of negativity and they're constantly boiling up until a big crisis point happens. To unpick their triggers takes a lot more work and a lot more, if you like, relationship building with that child before we can unpick them. For those children, knowing their vulnerabilities becomes really crucial. So we're at crisis point and we're wanting to watch, and we're almost wanting to time how long it takes that child to come out of that crisis point. Potentially there with no intervention if we're asking them to, in their safe space, bring themselves out of it. These two spikes are if we have interjected too soon, and unfortunately the only way we are going to know this is learn by trial and error. We'll approach that. Are you ready to talk yet? And if they throw something at you, usually the answer is no, so we'd back away. Or they will give you the firm no, I'm not ready. I've got to bank that, so that's 10 minutes after crisis, right, let's give them 15 minutes after crisis and I'll try again. And we have to trial and error that to know when is too soon, because we don't want another crisis hitting. The other thing I want to observe there is there another trigger that causes it? Particularly in the classroom environment, it might be that I've identified a child who's very good at pressing someone else's buttons, so when I go into crisis, that can be a second trigger. Observing all of this is crucial to prevent it from happening again and again. The one thing that we have to do is ensure that we catch the child right on the plateau before they're hitting the depression phase. And this is crucial because if a child is hitting the depression phase as part of the assault cycle after a crisis point, what we would tend to do then is externalise the cause of that behaviour. That's a way of self-protecting us, so there's no way I'd have acted like that because it's made me feel awful. So what we do is externalise the cause, we start placing blame, it wasn't me, it was them, and we push all that blame out so that I protect myself as a person. Unfortunately, if that happens, we are, if you like, reprogrammed for that assault cycle to happen again. The only way I can break that assault cycle is if I put in a support mechanism before they reach that depression phase, in hope that they'll internalise some of that responsibility. So quite often, just as if you like, I've talked you through that a little bit, this is something that I would use as part of CPD for staff in understanding perhaps why children are making specific choices at different points. It's part of a human response that we would all have. So how could I plot emotions? What would you plot and where? So quite simply, for a young person, we'd have strong emotions and weak emotions, and the language of positive or negative emotion. Interesting to see where they're going to put sadness and crying. So not only can you use these emotions, but actions and behaviours that are linked to emotions, and seeing what their interpretation is of those emotions, because that will help us moving forward. If I've got a stigma attached to certain emotional responses, it can help us unpick that and move forward. Another strategy that's mentioned in the toolkit is bounce. Belief, optimism, understanding the networks around you, contribution that you can have, and the energy that you bring to that. So just from looking at the words that they've used it within this strategy, you can see actually that these are the things we've talked about at the very beginning of creating an emotionally healthy child. So it is brilliant that we have got a visual that we could then use that helps support all of those areas of creating a well-balanced and rounded pupil that we'd be working with. And again, different emotions, they're scoring themselves out of 10. So we could link this to specific events or activities. And again, you could use this strategy as a bit of a self-assessment. So they could do this, how do you feel about this particular instance, or how you responded now. And after we've put some emotional teaching in place and supported them through perhaps their backward chaining and comic strip conversations, let's do it again with them. And have they got a different score? Are we able to shift to some of those scores for them? So it's a really brilliant strategy to use there. Respect feelings is really, really important, and what can we do? So it's not what happens to us, but it's almost how we sense and how that makes us feel that's going to impact on our mental health more significantly. So these are, if you like, tick this, and again, I'm not going to read through them, but how well do we do some of these things? And as a Senko, one of my sort of favourite things that I used to have as a privilege was these 5 or 10 minutes during every sort of staff meeting to drop in a little nugget of SEN, or identify a strategy, or just support staff moving forward. And again, it could be that, how do we tolerate frustration? What do we do? And just talk about 1 or 2 of these points to bring that back to the forefront, because our staff do have these skills. And sometimes we forget how skilled and skillful we are in dealing with this. So it will help bring it to the forefront. Reducing conflict and de-escalation. We will have individuals and practitioners that can do this naturally, and some that will need more coaching and modelling for that. For me, the best way is to watch somebody handle that situation. Now, that doesn't mean that when a child is in full crisis, I've got 1 key worker with them and then 10 people watching. We know that doesn't work well. I wouldn't even have 1 person watching. But is it possible that we've got an iPad recording for training purposes only? Whatever it could be, let's share those skills, knowledge and understanding, really. The biggest thing that I'm just going to point out to you, really, all of them are very important. This idea of the adult staying calm, or at least showing calm, is crucial. And giving the child the time to comply. Quite often, and I know I do it at home all the time, but I might start giving my countdown too quickly. Right, they're not ready to talk to me. Right, 5, 4, 3. Well, that's not conducive to anybody staying calm. But let's have a think about and know when humour's appropriate and not appropriate as well. Reconciliation. We have to make sure that we are there, and the most challenging thing here, we've got to hold on to that child until they're ready to hold on to themselves. What can we do to ensure that this is okay? Post-crisis, this is really, really important. So let's have a look. We've got to regain that control. We need to record what's happened. So at this point, and I certainly know what's best practice for us as a federation, we have our positive handling logs where each page is numbered, so nothing can be moved or torn out. And we talk about and we debrief with the child and parents what's happened there, because it's important to reflect what didn't work well, what was an additional trigger, and where are we going to de-escalate further. Of course, this is going to lead into perhaps a new risk assessment. But here's the key word: what do we need to do as the adults in the environment to reconcile with that child, to ensure that we are supporting that development of the relationship further and to rebuild following the incident. And one of the things and the strategy that's in the toolkit that we could use to do that is the hero conversation. Now, when we look at hero, we look at some of the questions within this slide, and I'll let you read it at your leisure. It doesn't have to be a set story that we're looking at. This could be any scenario that you want to face the child with. So it could be a clip from their favourite soap opera. It could just be a cartoon clip. It could be a clip of a playground incident, so on and so forth. But let's have the conversation. Who was the hero? How did it go well? Who was there to support them? So on and so forth. So when you see the hero conversation, you can link it now to a set strategy. The other thing that's mentioned within the toolkit is developing a RAP plan. So it's our Wellness and Recovery Action Plan. This is a registered approach, so when you start Googling it, you will see that it's used in lots of mental health circles, and different practitioners, for their different reasons, have then used it to perhaps fit their professional background and the children or young people or adults that they're working with. And the idea is that we figure out a way of keeping you well. And one of those things would be a daily maintenance, so those little things you have to do to keep yourself healthy. What are the stresses and the triggers? Any early warning signs that I might be emitting that people around me could identify? Or are there early warning signs that I can identify myself? When are things starting to break down? Now this could be a point within perhaps the school day, it could be a point of that academic calendar. What does crisis look like, and actually what's post-crisis? So what I've created for you, and again, if the colours aren't quite being picked up on this video for you, remember you can look back at the PowerPoint itself. So if it's crisis, things I'd be looking at: what am I like when I'm well? Activating that plan, supporters in moving forward with the plan. So that could be healthcare professionals in and around me, it could be the adults around me. Is there anybody in my community that can support me? So again, we might be talking and shifting this to the school community. And how do I then inactivate the plan? So once I've been in crisis, what's the point at which we can say, right, we're not in crisis anymore, we can move forward? When are things breaking down? So we're looking at signs here, and just some examples that might help you populate, but a lack of personal hygiene, a sign that they're not coping as well, that sense of escaping reality, and this can be something we notice from a very young age. So children can go into their own little bubble and in their world. Self-destructive, so that could be of relationships around you, it could be equipment around you. And the action, what we need to do there, well, they might be using their wellbeing tools and other tools available to them. We might see some sleep more, and we're going to offer them ways of accessing their support. External triggers, and again, be aware of these within the pupil and young people that you're working with. That could be pain, and of course that could be emotional pain or physical pain. And again, look back at the physical and sensory side of things to help you unpick some of those there. Environmental, Again, this trigger now could be a communication and interaction, response in terms of noise level, so on and so forth, trauma, abuse, anything that's irritating, unmet expectations. So ideas for you to think about, as well as tipping into those chemical imbalances. Our hormones would play a part there. An action now, well, the best thing to do is avoid the trigger. So how can I support that young person in ignoring or avoiding that trigger? Any red flag moments, so these are the warning signs. What do we do? So unhappiness, I'm dissociating myself, I'm a bit moodier. And what action I can do there? Well, I might not be able to remove triggers, but I might be able to minimise them. And daily maintenance, so what's in my toolkit to help me thrive and survive and keep well balanced. And this for me fits right back to our self-regulation slides that we talked about a few moments ago. What I'm like when I'm well, and remember that this is just a blip. So the RAP plan is something that can be really proactive and thought through with the young people and the families that you're working with. And this mental health first aid kit. So we talked about this wellness pack. What do they need? Do they need sort of physical stress relieving tools? Is it about listening to music? Is it exercise? Is it just a good cup of tea and a sit down? Do I need a bit of a cry? Do I need some time out with my technology and the things that I enjoy, or could I write this down? Just some examples, but we know that it could be anything for anyone, and it's important that we recognise that and work with the young people. So let's move on to self-esteem. So one of the strategies that we've got, or mentioned in the toolkit, is star quality. So you can see the link to Young Minds where you can find the full information, but I have screenshot some aspects to talk through with you really quickly. Short, sharp activity of 15 minutes. Age group can be primary or secondary. You will need a ball, and the idea is that you have a star outline for each pupil. We do have to consider that some children might find it easy to cope with and not, and reinforcing the rules about the safe space is really crucial. But as I say, you can look at that. And then we've got the learning objectives. So to identify these positive qualities about themselves. And children find this really difficult. And in fact, not just children, but one of the things that I would do, I'd do this with the teachers in my school and know how hard it is for teachers to actually talk about how brilliant they are. And then the idea is that they sit in a circle, they'll pass that ball around. It really opens up the conversation. We're organising them into groups and invite them to share some of those positive qualities as well. And then they can add that to their drawing. But as I say, it's in full detail there for you. Peer marking and around self-esteem is crucial, and it can be a really positive strategy to employ, but we have to make sure that we've set some boundaries in and around that peer marking also. So have clear assessment criteria. This will make sure it's really positive experience. Any annotations, perhaps we could give them examples, give them some model responses. Don't assume that peer marking will happen because they've seen your quality in marking. Make sure that you're giving the young people an outline to follow. For secondary pupils, it could look like this. So what went well, we could give them some sentence stems. The best bits about your work are you should feel proud of. And then some sentence stems again about how you could improve. And again, I've put secondary, but actually that could be for all ages of children. I'm just going to change what those prompts might look like. Now, I saw this, I take no credit for it. It came from the TESS website. And this really, it was about the high jump, so making sure how well somebody did the Frosby flop. I probably didn't say that right, but I'm not re-recording it. But there what we can do is we've got the objectives really clear, learning outcomes, and then a coded system for peers to work with each other effectively. So again, a secondary example, but it could be that you could readapt that for primary PE, and I like that as a visual, so I wanted to give you that as an idea. And then when we're talking about social, emotional, mental health, one of the things that we have to talk about would be attachment and relationship building. And this is a visual that I do tend to go back to time and time again, really. But we've got to be clear on how well do we know our pupils. So this diagram is called the circle of intimacy. Right at the heart of our circle and relationship building is ourself and our immediate family. Then we have our circle of friendship, followed by the circle of participation, and then the circle of exchange, which is where teachers and other professionals sit in. So the exchange dynamic is where I don't necessarily want to be there or have to be there, but are we exchanging in a communication? So for examples here, we've got doctors at the hospital, social workers, nurses, teachers, policemen, the postman, binman, so people that we would come in contact with. Our circle of intimacy, our mums and dads, this is where we form the understanding of relationships. And unfortunately, for a plethora of different reasons, ranging right across the social spectrum, some children's circles of intimacy are very chaotic, which means that they've got a different understanding of how relationships can work. Sometimes that's skewed more to the positive, sometimes more to the negative. What we will then tend to do is make friendships with children that have a similar sense of chaos in their lives. We are drawn to similar. It's quite often that staff room talk of, can you believe that Bobby and Jimmy playing together? The two kids that if we didn't want them playing together, you can't imagine it, can you? These are the conversations we have, and of course we can imagine it because they're alike and they're similar, and it is human nature to be around people that are like you, even if they love to hate each other. So because they've both got a chaotic circle of intimacy, their relationship is very up and down, and actually their relationship could be a catalyst for lots of negative behaviours, but it's like a magnet that pulls them towards each other. The next thing we have is our circle of participation. This is a really crucial circle in terms of developing relationships. We have to be able to experience different environments where rules are placed upon us but we want to be there. So an example of that might be brownies or guides or the local football club, rugby club, so on and so forth. So I have a motivation and a desire to be there, but I'm going to have to follow a set of rules. And this is crucial in terms of forming an understanding of social boundaries and how relationships work. One thing that we do know is if I am more vulnerable and my circle of intimacy is very chaotic, I have fewer opportunities to experience the circle of participation, which means that I tend to jump from a chaotic circle of intimacy right to the circle of exchange where I'm told what to do all the time, and we will know that that will be a catalyst for crisis and big behaviours. So opening up and trying to present in the school setting opportunities of participation are crucial. And hopefully by me just explaining that circle of intimacy to you, you can see why we need to spend time on those relationships, because we're almost re-educating that circle of intimacy, and we're trying to give the children opportunities to experience boundaries where they're motivated to be there. It's quite often why we're asked, perhaps by Ofsted and other external visitors such as myself, how are you opening up opportunities for your SEN learners and your more vulnerable pupils, your pupil premium children, to be part of extracurricular activities? So attachment issues that formulate from those chaotic scenarios. Good child development requires and needs attachment. So if my needs are met and I have solid relationships and understanding, I feel secure, my development will be good. Now, secure attachments, and this is where it can be really hard because the parent, it was good enough, they're from good households. Well, actually, we need to move away from that terminology. Some children might have had a secure attachment, even though they've had a circle of intimacy that's been fairly chaotic because, for instance, they're from a single home or they've lost a parent to a bereavement or loss. They can still have a secure attachment. So it doesn't necessarily figure that these huge crisis points relate into bad, but it's also sometimes not an effect of the parent themselves. Let's move away from those inverted commas, really. Insecure attachments can come from poor mental health. It can come from that self-esteem that can be intrinsic, not just this sort of view that we might have around toxic parenting. So as a practitioner, I'm going to remain open and I'm going to support the children in front of me, because actually we've got to be really aware of trauma. And so to put that into perhaps a reality experience that we've gone through over the pandemic, my youngest child is now just 10 months old. So for 10 weeks, throughout the pandemic, she's only been exposed to a very small circle of intimacy. So to try and expand her circle now, due to the situation that we're in, is going to be really challenging and really slow and steady steps forward. We could be facing those with similar scenarios right across the borough and certainly within your setting as well. So types of behaviours, it is not down to me as a professional to label attachment needs at all. We know there are perhaps different types of attachments, but for me it doesn't matter what it is, what the behaviour is, it's just about the strategies that I can put in place. So you'll notice that we haven't labelled attachment needs throughout the toolkit or with you today, because what's important is that attachment could be, I could have a child that's over clingy, quite compliant, disruptive if they're told no, desperate, fairly anxious. Likewise, I might have a child who feels fairly isolated, very sort of aggressive, openly angry. So we know that attachment can formulate different clusters of behaviours. And again, we'd be observing these behaviours to see how I can best support, what's their human response going to be like, and then linking back to the strategies I've already talked to you about. How are children affected by this? Well, you can see a huge list. And if I open this up to the floor, I'm pretty sure that we could have done about 10 slides just on thinking about how it can affect children. And it's usually this one extreme or another. I'm going to be hyper aroused, or actually my regulation is going to bring me right at the other end. And children can fluctuate between this due to that lack of attachment, because I am really confused. Everything's always been hot and cold for me in terms of my relationships. Factors to consider in school. How are we teaching these individuals? What strategies have we got in place for those cognition and learning approaches? My classroom management. Have we got the ethos of attunement at the very heart of our teaching moving forward? I know that we talked about in the communication and interaction part of the training, but are we openly talking about the thinking skills? Am I using my modelling to talk out loud and give that commentary to support young people as well? How are we developing that sense of self for the young people that we're working with? When it comes to differentiation, you'll notice some of these strategies in the toolkit. One thing to be really clear, when we're putting together a toolkit like this, it can be really hard, and we have slipped into, you know, the older children and younger children. And actually what it's more about is where that child is developmentally, because I could have a 13-year-old who developmentally is stuck in and around 7. and I have to go back to the strategies that would be successful at that point. And quite often when we're looking at children in the world of SEN requiring that additional support, we have become stuck developmentally at that point. So quite often we have to readjust how we're implementing these strategies to address those needs. We're going to function at a lower rate. So again, that sort of sits in line with bringing the pupil back to some of the strategies that we may feel instinctively are for younger pupils, but remember we're bringing them back to that developmental point. Are we modelling them right? Have we got the right hooks? Are we task slicing? All of these things to consider for you. But the other thing that I want to add also is this, especially within the environment that we're currently in, dealing with a caregiver's illness, you should hopefully know and be aware of any young people in your setting that are young carers. There's also a case that we suspect that children can be young carers, and following the recent pandemic this could have actually escalated. So it's something to bear in mind. And we've got to work with them very specifically, and we've got to open up that line of communication and make them feel that they feel secure, that they're not telling on anyone, that it's okay to be a young carer, and this is what it can look like and how we can support you. So please be aware of that, certainly as we move back into the autumn term. And note, especially in the world of attachment, we want progress to look beautiful, moving up a step at a time in regular chunks and constantly maintained. However, one of the things that we are really aware of in the world of social, emotional, mental health, that this is what I think success is going to look like, and actually I'm jumping steps. It was all higgledy-piggledy in the middle. It's that case of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But note that that's okay. And the biggest thing that we can do in the toolkit is ensure that we are keeping that evidence and moving forward to depict that we are still putting the strategies in place. Don't remove the strategies at all, but keep working forward with the young people to ensure that we will get there. And note, it doesn't matter how higgledy-piggledy that success was, we do get to the success, and we've got to bear that in mind. And certainly as SENCO or as SLT in a school, I'm going to be the voice that's driving that. Let's continue, because at some point we'll see progress. So let's move to anxiety in our young people. When does anxiety become a problem? Anxiety is a good emotion to have. It can bring you up. You just asked Nikki and myself. We were told that we were going to record the training, and we both suffered with anxiety following that. But actually we've got strategies to overcome, and it's good for you. It can raise your performance and yourself moving forward. However, if it becomes too severe that it causes self-esteem issues and harm, that's when we've really got to consider how we're going to move forward for our young people. Now again, apologies if it's small on the slide, but you will be able to access it through the PowerPoint itself. But I've given you some signs of anxiety, or what might we see in a child that's becoming anxious, for our younger children and our older children. So again, this is the checklist that we have to go through, but actually things that we might want to bear in mind that will help us drill down to the correct part of the toolkit. And then, why might my child be anxious? Well, actually, some people are natural born worriers, the overthinkers, right down to perhaps a traumatic event. Maybe I've got a fairly chaotic circle of intimacy, stressful life events. We know that teenagers are more likely to start suffering from a social anxiety. This is first and foremost a natural emotion and a natural response. It's how we provide strategies to overcome it that will mean that it either becomes a persistent problem or we can reduce it. And of course we do know some children that will remain a persistent struggle for us, but perhaps with something like that RAP plan, we've got those strategies in place continuously to support moving them forward. And how to help? Well, first and foremost, we listen. That's the absolute key. And remember at the start we talked about that congruence, that being with the child in the moment, that it's real and I'm here and I am listening. I'm not giving you 5 or 10 minutes here, I'm not dipping in and I'm not saying, are you all right, I'm walking past you, I'm listening to you. We talk, we reassure them, and together we find the solutions that are going to work for the child and in the setting. And if that child is old enough, and that might come again developmentally old enough, we could talk about the physical effects of anxiety, because that's perhaps how we can identify some of those early warning signs as well. And then some ideas and ways that we could ease that anxiety. And again, you can read those through at your leisure, but it's about ensuring that we've got the strategies in place. Sometimes we need to park that emotion and readdress it at a better time in the day or when more people are available. Sometimes I've got to address it there and then, and what does that look like? But let's prepare the children for what that will look like. And again, perhaps the RAP plan could work and lend itself effectively to that. But resources that you have got, or where you can go to find resources, Healthy Young Minds is fantastic, and as is Mind. So the links are there for you to click on. They will have a plethora of resources. And one thing that you can often find, and there are lists of apps for different ages that can support with anxiety. So I strongly suggest you have a look on there. One of the best ways moving forward that can be whole class, but certainly help identify some of those anxieties and stress, would be this stress container. Now, things to consider, that dependent upon how chaotic a child's circle of intimacy is, or perhaps their life experiences or in and around trauma, their stress bucket could be very big or actually naturally very small. So it's how resilient they can be. We have to bear that in mind. And then I'm going to talk this through with the young people. So in here would be all of the things that fill up our stress bucket. Lockdown probably being one of them for all of us at the moment. If my stress bucket gets too full, it can lead to an explosion. And when I have an explosion, this is what it might look like, and I'll add that there. Now, there are two things we can do. We can have helpful strategies to empty that stress container, and that's what we're aiming for. What can I do? It might be just talking to a familiar adult, I might be going for a walk, but what do I need to do to helpfully and healthily empty my stress bucket? Sometimes, unfortunately, we pick the unhealthy strategies. So an unhealthy strategy would be swearing at the teacher and storming out of the room if I'm too stressed. All that's going to do is refill my stress container, because there's going to be a consequence. I'm going to get in trouble. So I've actually just replaced that anxiety with another reason to fill my stress bucket. So as a visual, it can be really useful to use that with a young person, and to ensure that we are putting more weight towards the healthy strategies. And again, you can find more information from Mind on that approach. And if we are recovering from a trauma, then it's about feeling safe and secure. That's both physically and emotionally. It goes back to making sure that we are building our relationships and giving the children a way of expressing what's happened to them. And now, in terms of trauma training, if there's anything specific that you'd like to go through, then do get hold of us as a service as well. And in light of what's happening currently as a nation, I know there's lots of resources out there. It's well worth tapping into them currently. Speak to our colleagues at CAMS, the educational psychologists, and make sure that you feel really secure in handling that as a team of staff. And then resilience. Are we feeling resilient, and how do we ensure that we're developing resilience? We know that the best way of being a resilient pupil is having those relationships. It's coming back down to ensuring that we have developed those solid relationships. What scaffolding have I got in place? What's that protective buffer like around a child to help them become more resilient? So again, looking at the vulnerabilities could help you identify this as perhaps one of the issues for the young person you're working with. Ideas and ways of building resilience. So how are you going to facilitate those relationships, making them more self-efficient, becoming more independent? And again, if perhaps communication and interaction is another comorbid difficulty here, Nikki talked you through lots of examples on how to support independence using visual strategies as well that can help here. Learning to cope with the threats. Sometimes we can't remove the threats or the stressors, but we can help them feel that they can be resilient against them by giving them strategies. And the capabilities that underlie resilience. So these can be strengthened at any age, and this is really crucial. So it could be that I've lacked resilience and I've been unable to do this, but all of a sudden I've gained resilience. I'm going to go on my 5-mile run every night, and I am going to lose all the weight I've put on over lockdown. We can develop resilience at different ages, so don't give up when it comes to this aspect. It is never too late. So here's an example of physical exercise. You can see what's on my mind, can't you? But we've got the physical exercise. It reduces the stress. Building our executive functioning and strategies in and around that can help. Our self-regulation, coping and calming strategies. So these are potential avenues to support that resilience. So you can see how resilience kind of ties in everything in and around social, emotional, mental health. And some ways of building resilience for children, encouraging that healthy risk taking, allowing them to do that risky play is crucial. Acceptance of mistakes and losses, and so on and so forth. So have a look at those ideas. See in your setting, how are you ensuring that these are quality first conversations that you are having with the young people? And perhaps as the pupils are a little bit older, and you'll be able to see, I got this from a website called Parent and Teen, and it's also about building resilience within teenagers. But they talked about the 7 C's of resilience, and I like the language that they use here. It's kind of what we've referred to anyway, but confidence, believing in themselves, are they competent? So what skills do they need to get over that hurdle? Connection, character. So perhaps in my PHSCE or that form time, am I using that time wisely to teach some core values? Contribution, are they feeling as if they can contribute effectively? Are they coping well with the stresses in their life, and ensuring that they've got some control? What I liked about that as a visual and as approach is that it gives structure to perhaps a term that's fairly broad and abstract for some young people. So it brings it down and it can tie it through. So I'd certainly be following through the 7 C's with some of the young people I work with. And a big part of achieving that is young people seeing a sense of their future. And a couple of the strategies we've got to support them of that comes from Helen Sanderson Associates, who are absolutely fantastic at coming up with one-page profiles for young people, right from sort of social care through to education. And one of the things of the sense of future is to develop this pathway. So what's your goals and your ambitions? And this is where we are now. How are we going to get there? So what can make us stronger? What skills do I need moving forward? So as I say, it comes like sort of this social skills and social services background, but we can twist it in terms of our education to make it a really powerful tool. And then how can we do self-confidence effectively? Well, remember it's Maslow before Bloom. We have to make sure that I am supporting this hierarchy of mental health needs, giving them support, the treatment and the strategies, those relationships come in before I can deal with the self-care, the humour, before I can have empathy with anybody else, and above all, before I can get hope for my own future. And I think that for me as a visual can help put things in perspective on how far a child might have come if they can suddenly tell me what their hopes and dreams are. I think it's a really important day to debrief as an individual practitioner or as a team to demonstrate how far you've helped that young child come. And if that didn't give you goosebumps with the young people that you're working with, then it really should have done. What does mental healthy pupil look like, and let's reflect on that. And as a school setting, how are you going to move forward in sustaining that change? And again, one of the things and one of the ways we can do that is to have these person-centred toolkits. So I mentioned Helen Sanderson on the pathway because that's where the visual came from. But when you go on to her website, and there's some links there that should work via the PowerPoint, we can set independent goals, and that's going to help us move through and develop our healthy mental health. And another example of a personal action plan. What are you good at? What do I need to work on? What's my life goal? How am I going to take action? Again, things that can feel overwhelming and fairly abstract in the world of mental health, we can bring down to something that's tangible and that you can annotate upon and show progress in a concrete way can be really powerful. So that brings us to the end of our social emotional mental health. So hopefully that's brought to light some of the strategies that are in the toolkit for you. The thing for me and where to go from now is to grow the right ethos in your school and decide on the route in which you're going to do that. And the biggest school priority that we can have, and certainly following the pandemic, is putting those relationships at the heart of everything that we can do. So just as I think we've sort of said at the end of other training, if you have any questions that arise from this, go onto the North Star Inclusion website, find the links, do get in touch with us via email, and you'll find those emails at the start. And we'll try to gather resources for you, or certainly talk you through where possible. Thank you very much for listening, and take care.